everyone, it is time to talk more Starrcade. This is my continuing series of videos talking about the Starrcade events and the history of Starrcade, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at all 18 Starrcade events and ranking them from worst to best. So we're going to start with the weakest Starrcade, talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to work our way all the way through to the very best Starrcade, or at least my pick for the very best Starrcade. Again, these rankings are determined by nothing but my own opinions and my most recent rewatches, and in some cases, first-time viewings of the Starrcade events. And we're just going to jump right into it right now. So, my pick for the worst Starrcade is one that's kind of like right smack dab in the middle of kind of the gimmicky period of Starrcade, like that late 90s or late 80s, starting with Starrcade 89, really, with the Iron Man tournaments, and going on to about 92, where Starrcade was very kind of gimmicky, and they were focusing on things like the Iron Man tournaments and the Battle Bowls and things like that. And my pick for the worst one out of that bunch, and the worst Starrcade overall, is Starrcade 91. It's not that they did anything on the show that was that terrible. There's nothing on there that I would call, like, the worst of all time. It was just, the entire show felt like a bunch of nothing. It was the first time they did the Battle Bowl, and there just was nothing worth calling out. There wasn't a worst match. There wasn't a best match. It was just a bunch of tag matches featuring a bunch of people, and it ended with a meaningless battle royal at the end where Sting ultimately won, but it was the first Starrcade where it felt like nothing happened. Prior to that, you got a bunch of big matches, big moments. Even at Starrcades 89 and 90, like, it felt like stuff happened, even if it wasn't a whole hell of a lot. Here, it just felt like it was just a bunch of nothing. And some might say that there are Starrcade events that are worse than this, and they would probably have a point. I just feel like this was like a interesting concept. The Battle Bowl itself is kind of an interesting concept. Maybe WCW's attempt at trying to do their own version of the battle, or of the Royal Rumble, but ultimately the prize meant nothing, and none of the matches really stayed with me. Nothing of consequence really happened. It's just I watched it and then it immediately exited my brain, which is almost worse than if it was just straight up terrible. Because at least if it was straight up terrible, it would be memorable and I would have something to talk about. But Starrcade 91 was just this empty void that left no impression on me, which, like I said, is probably worse than me straight up hating it. Was there anything cool or worth talking about on the show? Well, the nicest thing I can say about it is the collection of talent involved, where you had guys like Vader, Steve Austin, Jushin Liger, Diamond Dallas Page, Mick Foley, Rick Rude, all the names I listed making their Starrcade debut. And it was nice to see, like, all those talents involved. Sting was in it, obviously, and ended up winning. It was just a shame that all these talents couldn't be involved in something a little bit more substantial. But Starrcade 91, easily my pick for the weakest Starrcade. Then from there, we go to 2 years earlier, Starrcade 89 with the Iron Man tournaments. And basically the entire show was, you had the Iron Man singles tournaments, where it was a round-robin tournament involving Sting, Lex Luger, the Great Muta, and Ric Flair. The tournament was ultimately won by Sting, the Ric Flair versus Sting being the closing match, probably their weakest match together, their least substantial match together, anyway. And you had the Tag Team Iron Man tournament, which was the Road Warriors, the Steiner Brothers, the Samoan SWAT team, and Doom. And unfortunately, the format didn't lend itself to that great of a show. There's some great talents involved in this. And apparently, the idea for Starrcade 89 came from Jim Ross, because they were trying to come up with a way to, they had already wrapped up the Ric Flair-Terry Funk feud, so they couldn't do Funk versus Flair for the title again. And they knew they were going to build to Sting versus Flair, but they wanted to hold off on it and give it the proper weight and build up instead of just rushing it to Starrcade. So this was the first time where Starrcade didn't have that WrestleMania, season finale type of feel that I've talked about in previous videos, and instead just kind of felt like a roadblock on the road to something bigger instead. And what we got here was like two kind of senseless tournaments, and even the big matches that we got out of it, like Road Warriors versus Steiner Brothers, which is cool on paper, didn't feel as big as they could have been because it just felt like another, it felt like another tournament match. And, all these guys had to work 3 matches throughout the show. So a lot of repetition. It felt like you were just seeing the same people over and over and over again. And the end result was something that was largely uninteresting. And a little bit better than Starrcade 91. So if you're going to go for gimmicky Starrcades, this is probably the better one to go for. But a couple of things, if I had to pick a worst match, it would probably be Doom versus the Samoan SWAT team because it was the 2 heel teams going at it. And it was largely uninteresting because both teams are somewhat similar to each other in style and presentation. So, for as cool as it is to see the Road Warriors and the Steiners face each other, Doom and the Samoan SWAT team is like the opposite end of that, where it's like, oh, you're the 2 teams that are just taking up space, and you have to fight each other out of necessity for this tournament. My favorite match on the show was Sting versus the Great Muta. They typically had very good matches with each other, and this was no exception. These matches, I remember talking about it in an old video I did for Sting years ago, where I said, like, these matches were kind of what got me interested in Japanese wrestling, because I became a big Sting fan, so I started to track down all the Sting matches I could find. And when I came across these matches, I'm like, who's this Great Muta guy? And that led me down the road of finding out more about Japanese wrestling. So I have a lot of affection for this match and the series of matches that Sting and Great Muta had. But other than that, Starrcade 89 is kind of a wash. All right, and next one from there, we're going to be doing a very early Starrcade, the second one, actually. Starrcade 84, for as good as Starrcade 83 was, and that one was a success in a lot of ways. They put the belt on Flair, defeating Harley Race in a steel cage match to close the show. There was the dog collar match. There was a great tag title match. There was a lot going on that show, and that one felt like a very good, well-executed big event. For as good as that show was, Starrcade 84 made all the mistakes. And this one kind of felt like a misfire in a lot of ways. This was the one that was headlined by Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes with special guest referee Smokin' Joe Frazier. And you see Smokin' Joe Frazier as the referee of a main event that almost has like a WrestleMania type of feel to it. And Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, that should be really good. Unfortunately, the match ended with kind of a fluky, stupid finish where Smokin' Joe stopped the match due to Dusty Rhodes bleeding, and it just was a very unsatisfying ending to the show for what should have been a really good main event. And I know it set the stage for Starrcade 85 a year later, but it felt like a huge misfire while watching it. And unfortunately, there wasn't a whole hell of a lot going on throughout the show that kept me interested. The best match was Tully Blanchard versus Ricky Steamboat for the NWA TV title, but even that match had kind of a BS finish that I didn't care for very much. So, not a whole lot going on here. There were some things to enjoy, like Manny Fernandez versus Black Bart in the Brass Knuckles title fight. That one was kind of a fun, like, oh, look at these 2 guys beat the shit out of each other. That was kind of a fun match, but it also had a terrible U.S. title match between Wahoo McDaniel and Superstar Billy Graham, and so it was more misses than hits, and the main event was such a disappointment that was like, man, that's not how you want to end any pay-per-view main event, especially a Starrcade, one that's supposed to be your biggest show. Very unsatisfying. Fortunately, they would bounce back the next year in 85, but the second Starrcade wasn't very good. Next up on the list is 1999, a dead year for WCW. They already had one foot in the grave at this point creatively, and the other foot was going to be financially, and that was that foot was slipping. And we were coming up on the end of WCW, and I've talked about it before, but 99 was where the company completely lost me, and I just couldn't get behind a lot of the booking and a lot of the stuff they were doing. That said, Jeff Jarrett deserves special mention for playing double duty in the event. He had the bunkhouse match with Dustin Rhodes, which was a pretty good brawl, and then he had that great U.S. title ladder match with Chris Benoit. And it just goes to show, it's like, man, Jarrett really worked his ass off on this show. It was kind of the kind of the savior of the event in a way. And I also have to say, there was that match between DDP and David Flair in the crowbar and a pole match, which was significantly better than it had any right to be. And I guess it speaks more to the talent of DDP than it does David Flair, that DDP was able to get a relatively solid match out of him. But it also had that terrible Nash versus Sid powerbomb match, which I said was, in my previous video, I said was the worst match in Starrcade history. And it also ended with that unfortunate Bill Goldberg versus Bret Hart match, which wasn't a terrible match, but was the end of Bret Hart's career as we knew it, suffering that stiff kick from Goldberg that would ultimately end the Hitman's career. And it ended on a stupid, shitty kind of, Roddy Piper's call to end the match. And again, very unsatisfying ending to a Starrcade main event. And very, very bad pay-per-view all around, despite a few bright spots to elevate it above the dregs of the list. Next up is one that's probably some people would rank this a little high, or probably there are some people that would rank this lower than I would. But I'm going to go with Starrcade 97 at the next spot. This one gets the nod for being the most disappointing pay-per-view in history. And I talked about it when I did the What Went Wrong video. This could have been like the ultimate good guys win, bad guys lose type of pay-per-view. This could have been like the ultimate, the bad guys get their comeuppance and the fans get to go home happy style of event. Sting should have walked out and beaten Hogan for the title. Like I said, they could have done that in 30 seconds instead of the convoluted mess that they ended up doing. We should have gotten Flair getting revenge on Curt Hennig for what he did at Fall Brawl. We didn't get that. We should have gotten the Giant defeating Kevin Nash. We didn't get that. There's a lot of things they could have done, and unfortunately, it just didn't happen. Fortunately, you did get DDP winning the U.S. title from Curt Hennig, which ended up being the best match on the show. Sting winning the title at the time felt good, even though they horribly mismanaged it. And, Bischoff versus Zbyszko was fun for what it was. It was, like a dog and pony show, but it was fun to watch Zbyszko go over on Bischoff. So at least something of value happened on the pay-per-view. So it wasn't like among the worst pay-per-views I've ever seen, but given the hype and the build-up to it, it should have been one of the ultimate feel-good pay-per-views, and they dropped the ball on that big time, both in the execution of the main event and in just a bunch of stuff going against them, like the what happened with the injuries in certain matches that had to be dropped. Very unfortunate all around that it turned out the way that it did. But Starrcade 97, it assumes a very special place in history for all the wrong reasons. All right, next up on my list, I've got 1995, which is a show when I rewatched it, I was hoping it was going to be better than it ended up being. This was another very gimmicky Starrcade where it was the WCW versus New Japan style show. And while there wasn't a whole lot of storyline intrigue going on with the show, I was expecting like all these interesting talents to create a bunch of interesting matches that you don't normally see, and it would be a fun show. Instead, it kind of reminded me of that one Bound for Glory that TNA did, where it was just their guys having a bunch of random matches that nobody cared about, and the overall show just kind of fell flat. It just felt like people were not invested in the WCW versus New Japan concept, and the end result was kind of a flat show, with a couple of solid matches, like Benoit versus Liger was solid. Eddie versus Otani, I thought that was the match of the night. And but then you also got a bunch of flat matches like Savage's match and Alex Wright's match, and unfortunately the flat matches outnumbered the good matches, and even the title match that was tacked on at the end, the triangle match with Flair, Sting, and Luger, and then Flair facing Savage for the title and ultimately winning, that didn't feel as big as it could have been, and I was kind of hoping that was going to be better than I remembered it. Unfortunately, that was not the case. So, I don't know, just got to shrug your shoulders and go. It was an interesting idea, but ultimately a failed concept. And another entry in the list of like more of the gimmicky Starrcades that was centered around kind of a gimmick rather than storyline characters and build-up, which is what I think we've been... wrestling has shown us time and time again that should be the focus and should be the driving point of selling your pay-per-views and not a bunch of gimmicks. But what do I know? Next up is Starrcade 90. which is an unfortunate one for me because this was Sting's big Starrcade as the champion, where he was going in as the champion, and unfortunately he got stuck in that situation with the Black Scorpion, where, I talked about the 89 match with Flair and Sting being their weakest one. This one's a close second because it was so sad to see Ric Flair, under a mask and try so hard not to give away the fact that it's Ric Flair under the mask. So it was like you could tell he was struggling not to do his trademark Ric Flair stuff. And it just led to a very awkward looking main event. And the reveal of Ric Flair as the Black Scorpion is underwhelming to say the least. But the entrance was kind of cool. I'll give it that. And unfortunately, 1990 was not a good time for WCW. There was a lot of weak stuff going on. There was the Pat O'Connor tournament that was a big part of this show that ultimately was very uninteresting. It was kind of like a weak version of when TNA would do the World X Cup and things like that. And ultimately, kind of a weak tournament all around. The Mexico versus UK match was really, really bad, by the way, just throwing that out there. But it wasn't without its good moments. There were two matches I really enjoyed. That was Doom versus Arn Anderson and Barry Windham for the tag titles in a street fight. I thought that was very good. And the Stan Hansen-Lex Luger U.S. title match, the Texas Lariat match, was a pretty good little fight. I thought the Luger-Stan Hansen feud was really good, actually. And another example I use of when people say that Lex Luger sucked, I'm like, I don't know, I liked his stuff with Stan Hansen and various other things. So there was some stuff that I enjoyed from Starrcade 90, just not a whole hell of a lot. And then we move on to Starrcade 94, which is probably ranked a little too high for a lot of people. I've heard a lot of people say this is the worst Starrcade. And in some ways I agree, but I will give it this. It breezed by pretty quickly. It seemed to be a fast-paced show, and there's a lot of crap on the show. We can talk about the Hogan Butcher main event. We can talk about Kevin Sullivan versus Mr. T. Both awful, fully agree. But there was some stuff I enjoyed. I actually enjoyed Paul Levesque versus Alex Wright. Paul Levesque. I wonder if he went on to do anything. I'm not sure. So that's a weird match that kind of was weird to go back and look at Triple H at that young point of his career and say, oh, look at him go. And he had a pretty solid match with Alex. And there were a couple matches I enjoyed. I thought match of the night was Duggan versus Vader for the U.S. title. Where Vader ultimately won the U.S. title. And I thought the ending to the pay-per-view was very cool, with Vader challenging Hulk Hogan and setting up their matches for 1995. And which were clearly much bigger and far more interesting matches than Hulk Hogan versus Brutus the fucking Barber Beefcake. So this is another Starrcade that kind of felt like a bump in the road rather than the main payoff to a bunch of stuff. But setting up Vader Hogan was kind of cool, and like I said, I liked the Duggan Vader match, and I liked a couple of other matches, even though large chunks of the show were really bad and the main event was really weak. It was less painful than some of the other ones ranked below it. So that maybe I'm damning it with, or maybe I'm praising it with Fate and Damnation. I don't know, or whatever. I don't even know how to say it, but. It was Starrcade 94. I don't hate it as much as others do, but it's still not great. And still on the not-so-great list, and one that actually shot up much higher on the list than I expected, Starrcade 2000, the final Starrcade event, where WCW was on death's door. They would be done and over with 3 months later. But this show had a bunch of young people who were clearly trying to make a name for themselves and make up for the fact that WCW was just in the shitter. And you got a bunch of people working very hard to try and cover for the fact that WCW just wasn't very good. There was that cruiserweight ladder match that opened up the show, which was just a wild car wreck of a match. You got Terry Funk versus Crowbar for the hardcore title, which was fun. You got the tag title match with the Insiders, DDP and Nash, defeating the New Blood guys, Palumbo and O'Hare, I believe it was, and they had Ric Flair in their corner. That had kind of a classic, WCW feel to it, where DDP and Nash won the title. So there was some stuff that I enjoyed. There was some awful stuff as well, like Big Vito and Reno versus Chronic, which was a terrible match. And there were a lot of bad signs of WCW during this period, but even the main event, like Steiner and Sid, I didn't hate the match, surprisingly. I thought this like, oh god, they're not going to mesh well at all, and it actually wasn't that terrible of a match, all things considered. But Starrcade 2000, it excelled in low expectations. Anything from WCW in 2000, you go into it with super low expectations, and the fact that I wasn't miserable, kind of a win. Was kind of a win for Starrcade 2000. Not a great ending to the Starrcade legacy, or a great ending to the final Starrcade, the final year of WCW pay-per-views, but it was what it was, and I wasn't miserable, so there's that. 1998 is the next one on the list. Best match here goes to the dual cruiserweight title match, which is a very interesting situation where you had Kidman defending the title against Rey Mysterio and Juventud Guerrera in a triple threat match, and then would go on to defend the title against Eddie Guerrero for the cruiserweight title, with Billy Kidman walking out successful in both matches. It was very interesting to see Kidman during this period, because it's clear that they were trying to push him, and it's almost like he was kind of WCW's version of Bret Hart circa 91, where it was like, all right, he's this young guy that we want to invest in, and we're going to try and do something with him. And, he's fresh off of coming out of the flock, and he's starting to carve a name for himself, and I think his two matches here showed him off pretty well. I also really enjoyed Diamond Dallas Page versus the Giant, which is another match where you think it's like, I don't know, how well are they going to mesh together? And I thought they meshed together pretty well. The Giant was out the door at this point. They had pretty much already ruined him by turning him heel. I've talked about that before. But for what it was, I thought DDP and the Giant actually had the best match they could possibly have with each other. That top rope diamond cutter was really, really cool. And other stuff I enjoyed, Conan versus Chris Jericho for the TV title was a solid match. It was probably the best match I've ever seen Conan have. That was a pretty good match. So there was stuff to enjoy on the undercard for Starrcade 98, and WCW still had some of that fire that they had during their height in the Monday Night Wars period. 98 was when you started to see dents in the armor. I've talked about it before with stupid heel turns of like Bret Hart and the Giant, the failed run of the Ultimate Warrior, and a bunch of other mishaps that were going on. But during this period, they still had some of that fire, and unfortunately, this is probably where the fire got snuffed out, because this is also the show that has the main event where Kevin Nash senselessly ended Goldberg's undefeated streak, and we all know what happened after that, so no need for me to bring it up. But it was the main event was not great, and not ideal, especially looking back on it with 2020 hindsight. But I thought the undercard had a lot of stuff that I really enjoyed, so I will give it credit for that. And like I said, the excitement for WCW was still there, even though it was waning at this point. All right, next on my list, number 8 by my count, Starrcade 1992, which is probably, it's a very interesting period for WCW, where 92 was when Bill Watts had control and was doing some very stupid things with the booking, but also did some really cool things with the booking. So it had like kind of an old school mindset of like building up matches in the traditional sense, and some of that yielded great results. But then he would do stupid things like making top rope moves illegal, which is the most ass backwards thing I've ever seen in my entire life. The single stupidest decision I've ever seen a major promotion do is that decision right there. As a kid, I was utterly perplexed by it, but Starrcade 92 showed off kind of the best and the worst of this period for WCW, where you got some really good stuff out of it, and you also got some, ugly stuff out of it, where the dumb stuff of 1992 and the early 90s period kind of reared its ugly head. The Lethal Lottery / Battle Bowl was still a thing and a major selling point of the pay-per-view, which, probably not the ideal thing to sell a pay-per-view around, again, unless you're going to turn it into something. Because the reason the Royal Rumble caught on as well as it did, of course, a few years later, they would turn it into a battle for the WrestleMania title shot, which gave it a lot more significance. But also, they used it as a great tool to build other feuds, and that's not something that they did very well with the Battle Bowl. Maybe a little bit with Sting and Luger in 91, maybe a little bit with Sting and Vader in 92. But generally, they didn't do that great of a job using the Battle Bowl to kind of elevate people or elevate feuds and make it feel like it mattered or meant something. And this year it was won by Great Muta, and it's like, no knock on Muta. It was just kind of like, all right, what are you going to do with him? And not a whole hell of a lot by all appearances. But while I was not a fan of the Battle Bowl, there was some stuff I really did enjoy on this show, namely Sting versus Vader in the King of Cable match, which was very, very cool. And an excellent match. And also the tag title match, Steamboat and Shane Douglas taking on Barry Windham and Brian Pillman. Excellent tag title match. If you're a fan of tag team wrestling, I highly recommend checking that match out. It's great. Both matches I just named were on my top 10 Starrcade match list. So it really goes to show. It's like, 92 had some problems, but it also had two of my top 10 favorite Starrcade matches on it as well. And both of those matches ranked fairly high up there too. So a lot of good stuff going on in 92 amidst like a bunch of misfires and mishaps as well. So generally I enjoyed the show more than I enjoyed like a lot of the individual parts of the show, maybe more so than the sum of all those parts, but the stuff I liked was so good that it elevated the show significantly in my eyes. And then from there we go to the next year's event, 1993, which was correctly labeled as the 10th anniversary of Starrcade. Good for them. Vince should have taken a page out of their book there. But there was some stuff that didn't work, namely Shockmaster versus Awesome or King Kong, or that weird ass tag team, Awesome Kong and King Kong, which was their super fat guy team. But that match wasn't very great. But generally, I really enjoyed a lot of what was on here. We got a nice sleeper hit between Pretty Wonderful and Too Cold Scorpio and Marcus Bagwell in a solid tag match. But really, the best thing about this show was the main event and the build-up to that main event, where they really made it feel like Vader versus Flair, title versus career, was a really big deal and a really big main event. And after a few years of doing these really gimmicky Starrcade events with the Battle Bowls and the Iron Man tournaments and even the Black Scorpion stuff, which was stupid, it was nice to see something more traditional and something more exciting in Flair's career on the line, and he has to go up against this near unbeatable monster. How's he going to do it? And the end result was a fantastic main event and another one of my favorite matches in Starrcade history. So I think 93's event deserves a lot of praise for that alone. All right, now we're up to number 6. We are back to the 80s. Starrcade 1987. This is right around like kind of peak Jim Crockett period, where you get a lot of really good stuff on here from top to bottom. You get Dusty Rhodes winning the U.S. title, which is great. You've got this opening 6-man tag, which was a lot of fun to watch, where Sting making his Starrcade debut, teaming with the Freebirds to take on Rick Steiner, Eddie Gilbert, and Larry Zbyszko. A nice collection of talent there. You've got Nikita Koloff versus Terry Taylor for the TV title. You've got a UWF presence on the show, which was cool to see, and a lot of like unification matches throughout the show, which gave the show a very nice flavor and a kind of like interpromotional appeal that actually felt exciting rather than like a cheap gimmick. And unfortunately, this was also one of the weaker main events. This was Flair versus Ronnie Garvin, which is about as exciting as it sounds, unfortunately. Not that the match was terrible or anything. It was just terribly uninteresting because, it's like, okay, Flair shouldn't lose that match. He really shouldn't be losing to Ronnie Garvin. And just a questionable selection for a Starrcade main event. And this is coming after 86, which was Flair versus Nikita Koloff, which was another one that was weird. And it's like, man, this is strange stuff going on. But my favorite match on the show was the tag title match. You got the classic heel tag team, Arn and Tully, two of the Four Horsemen, later known as the Brainbusters in the WWE, one of the greatest tag teams of all time, going up against the badass Road Warriors for the NWA tag team titles. Great mixing of talent, great clash of characters, and the end result was a very exciting contest that I really enjoyed. All right, so that's Starrcade 87. Next up, we get the previous year's event, Starrcade 86 at number 5. Again, a lot of really good matches all around. You get this is most known for the Skywalkers match, the Road Warriors taking on the Rock and Roll Express, and the finish to that match is definitely the biggest highlight from this particular Starrcade. Scaffold matches are very dangerous, and I don't recommend doing them. But I'm sure Jim Cornette doesn't look back on this match fondly, but it was a highlight and one for the ages, and it was one of the all-time classic Starrcade moments, if you want to look at it that way. So, very memorable in that regard. My favorite match, though, was the Rock and Roll Express taking on the Andersons in a steel cage match. I thought that was a really cool match. You also got Ronnie Garvin taking on Big Bubba in a street fight, Big Bubba being the future Big Boss Man. And that was a nice little stiff fight, and that was cool to see. Again, the show is unfortunately kind of hampered by a somewhat uninteresting main event. The match itself wasn't terrible. It was, like I said, it was Flair and Nikita Koloff, but it doesn't have that big match appeal to it. It was just kind of felt like they threw Nikita in there because they didn't know what else to do. And it's like, Flair can work with anybody, fuck it. And that seemed to be the mindset of this match, but it wasn't one of the bigger main events or one of the more significant main events. And unfortunately, that kept 86 from being in, like, truly top tier for Starrcade, but other than that, I thought it was a very entertaining show. All right, number 4 is the very first Starrcade event, 1983. I've talked about this one a lot, and like I said, it is one of the all-time classic wrestling events and kind of a trendsetter for what Starrcade would be throughout the 1980s, and even give WrestleMania a few pointers on how to build matches and how to do great payoffs when the time is right to do those payoffs. The biggest moment, obviously, is Ric Flair winning the title from Harley Race in the steel cage main event. My favorite match, of course, as I've said earlier, is Roddy Piper versus Greg Valentine in the dog collar match, one of the most classic Starrcade matches. And you even get, like, a very good tag title match with Jay Youngblood and Ricky Steamboat taking on the Briscoe brothers for the tag titles. Very, very good match. There's a few undercard, like, kind of duds on there, but nothing that's damaging, and the big match is delivered, which is what matters the most when you're doing an event like this. It felt big. It was big, and like I said, it set the trend for what Starrcades were going to be like moving on in the future. So, Starrcade 83, fourth best Starrcade, is not a bad position to be in, and I think it's a worthwhile event, and for wrestling historians, I think it's absolutely must-see viewing. All right, number 3 on my list is 1996, the best Starrcade of the 1990s, and the best one during the Monday Night Wars period. And of all the Starrcades during the Monday Night Wars period, I think this one best represents the best of WCW during that period. It's most known for the Piper-Hogan main event, which is not the greatest match in the world, admittedly. And people seem confused on, is it a title match or is it a non-title match? But Piper beating Hogan and the match having the atmosphere that it did made it feel like it was worth it. And the end result was, at the time, the biggest buy rate in WCW history. So I think it deserves a lot of credit for that. Now, the best match was the Cruiserweight title match between Dean Malenko and Ultimo Dragon, which was the Cruiserweight title and the J-Crown unification match, which was very, very good. There were plenty of other matches I enjoyed on there as well. There's the Outsiders versus the Faces of Fear was a nice kind of like knockdown, drag-out fight. You got Rey Mysterio versus Jushin Liger, which was also a really good match that I enjoyed. Very solid undercard on here that showed off a lot of the best that WCW had to offer during this period. The exciting NWO angle, big stars like Roddy Piper coming in. The Cruiserweight division was on fire. The tag team division was doing really well with... And I talked about it when I went back and rewatched Nitro. Like, the tag division seemed to be defined by these bruiser badasses that just beat the shit out of each other, whether it be Harlem Heat, the Steiner Brothers, the Faces of Fear, and even the Outsiders. And it was cool to see that on display as well. So if you want to see like a microcosm of the best of WCW during its major peaks and heyday, I think Starrcade 96 is a really good show to look at in a lot of respects. I think it showed off many of the best elements that WCW had to offer during that time. And it was a very exciting show when I went back and rewatched it. Second best Starrcade of all time is arguably one of the biggest ones during the 1980s. 1985, The Gathering. This was an interesting show that emanated from two venues, kind of like doing WrestleMania 2 before WrestleMania 2. It was almost like Vince watched this event and was like, fuck that, I can do a show from three venues in three different time zones. Watch me. But yeah, this had that interesting thing going for it, which didn't really add a whole heck of a lot, to be honest, because the two venues didn't look that different from each other, so it didn't really give the two portions of the show a huge feel, but they were switching back and forth, and I even lost track of which venue was which, unfortunately. But that gimmick aside, I thought top to bottom, you got a lot of really exciting matches on here. You did get two cage matches. The tag title one, which was solid, Rock and Roll Express taking on the Russians for the tag titles. Solid match, but really the major highlight here was my pick for the greatest match in Starrcade history, Tully Blanchard versus Magnum TA in the I Quit steel cage match. Awesome bloodbath fight from start to finish, and one of the best matches of the 1980s, in my opinion, and great stuff all around it. If you watch Starrcade 85 for no other reason, watch it for that match. It's definitely worth checking out. It was a very gimmick-heavy pay-per-view with like a Mexican hat on a pole match and an arm wrestling match, and so maybe it was a little over-gimmicked, but generally I thought the show was very exciting all the way throughout, and you got a much better Dusty Rhodes Ric Flair main event with Dusty winning the title, and it felt like a big deal to see Dusty win the title at the main event of a Starrcade, and that was great. So, great main event, best match in Starrcade history, bunch of gimmicks going on, but generally an exciting show from start to finish. But my favorite Starrcade of all time is going to go to 1988, which I alluded to in my last video where I did the top 10 Starrcade matches of all time, and 3 of those matches came from 1988. And that's a big reason as to why Starrcade 88 is my favorite. It has 3 of my top 10 favorite matches, which is more than any other Starrcade event. But it also didn't rely so much on gimmicks. Like I said, 85 was very gimmick heavy, and then you look at shows like 89 and 91 and 92 and 95, which relied very heavily on gimmicks and just gimmicking the holy hell out of the event to try and make it more sexy for the viewers. But this one, they just worried about building up big matches and then delivering payoffs. And that formula is generally more exciting to me than just throwing a bunch of gimmicks out there. You had a really solid TV title match between Mike Rotunda and Rick Steiner, which was really cool. It was cool to see Rick Steiner win a singles title. I'm a big mark for the Steiner brothers, so obviously I enjoyed that. There was Sting and Dusty Rhodes taking on the Road Warriors for the tag titles, which was, again, very exciting. There was the battle of the 2 Midnight Expresses with Paulie Dangerously and Jim Cornette going at it, adding a lot of flavor to that situation in that match. That was very cool and very good to see. And you got my pick for the greatest main event in Starrcade history, Ric Flair versus Lex Luger, a big clash in styles, and an excellent display of both men's talents and what they were able to do and what they brought to the table as far as their abilities goes. And yes, I know I defend Lex Luger a lot. People say that he sucked. And I'm like, no, he had his moments, and that's definitely one of his moments, was that Starrcade main event. And yes, he's working with Ric Flair. I understand that. But Ric Flair also worked with Ronnie Garvin and Nikita Koloff, and it wasn't as good as this. So Luger had to bring something different to the table that those other opponents didn't bring the previous 2 years. So, so that concludes it. I have ranked all 18 Starrcade events. Thanks again, everybody, for watching. I have one more Starrcade video to do, and then I have my final live stream, which will be my final video of the year, and then I'll sign off for the holidays and take my usual break that I normally do around this time. But thanks again, everybody, for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. The link is in the description down below. And check out the Weekday Warriors of Wrestling channel. Our last episode was just posted a few days ago. Be sure to check that out, and we will have more content for you as the weeks go on. So that is all I have for you now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I will see you all later.